Hello, this is North of Normal, a podcast about Canadian cinema and our relationship with film. My name is Andrew Hunter Scholey, and today we are talking about The Wrong Guy, released in 1997, directed by David Steinberg, screenplay by Dave Foley, David Anthony Higgins, and Jay Kogan. And today to talk about this criminally underseen movie, I have Joshua Manchuk. Joshua, how you doing there?
Hey man, how are you?
Not too bad. This is our first call-in episode here in the midst of the wonderful pandemic that the world finds itself in. So it's good we can do something while the apocalypse is going on.
Yay!
I mean,
it's on the apocalypse.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Joshua is calling us from Toronto, my old stomping ground, where I'm from originally. Why don't you tell the folks a little bit about yourself there?
Well, I've got a bit of a film background. I spent my adolescence and early adult life in Vancouver, so I went to the old Vancouver Film School. Yay. Sarcasm. But then while I was out there, I did get to work in film and television for a year or two, and then decided I was going to move to Toronto at the same time when all of the Toronto film industry was going to Vancouver, and it didn't come back. So I came out here, and then I've been living. I met you through my lovely wife, and we bonded over comic books and film, and lo and behold, here I am.
Yeah, and I was trying to think today. I worked with Kathy, 15 years ago at this point?
Yeah, it's gotta be.
Something bonkers crazy like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, I haven't lived in the same city as you guys for quite a long time, but every once in a while when I'm in town, it's good to stop by and check in on you guys and see how you're making out.
Yep. Last time I saw you actually was years ago when you were out right before your friend's wedding, where we all went out and met at the Granite.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy because my family lives up north, so usually I have like a day in like Toronto before I scoot off to spend time with the family, and it's just tough to balance with everybody what's going on and what's happening. But definitely next time I'm in town, I'm going to look you guys up there.
Fun.
We're talking about The Wrong Guy because when I first was ruminating on this podcast, I had this sort of weird thing that every so often I stumble across a movie and be like, oh yeah, this is Canadian. I can talk about this. And I kind of on social media randomly threw something up about The Wrong Guy because this has been a longtime favorite film of mine, pretty much ever since it came out. And you immediately responded, and I just asked you, hey, when we start out calling in, would you be willing to do it? And you were just immediately yes. So I'm glad almost a year later to finally have you here. For most of the world, let's be honest, who don't know what this movie is, do you mind giving a brief rundown as to what The Wrong Guy is?
Yeah, well, honestly, it's just a perfect Dave Foley film. He plays a wannabe go-getter in the corporate world, and haphazardly stumbles upon his boss's murder and basically thinks that the police are after him and goes on a comedically Canadian road trip, if you will. And is it a gem. It's one of those movies I don't want to share with people, but at the same time, people need to know about it.
Well, we'll get into this. I mean, I have my notes here in front of me. I say this about almost every episode I do. There isn't a lot of information out there on this movie. You really got to go.
There's nothing.
You got to go digging around. Even like for some of the basics, I couldn't even find a single website that did indeed verify that this was a Canadian film.
Yeah, I think the only reason I can guarantee some of it is like just being, in my cups and wandering around downtown. I think I've stumbled in a few of the interior scenes.
Yeah, it was filmed over
the office building.
Yeah, it was filmed over 2 months actually in Toronto in 1996. There was a lot going on with Dave Foley at that time. This was supposed to be. We'll get this out of the way. I mean, we're the perfect age for Kids in the Hall.
Yes,
we were probably the right age. I think I started watching Kids in the Hall as it was airing when I was like 14, 15 years old on CBC, trying to make sure that my parents didn't know exactly what I was watching because it was so scandalous at the time, my little 15-year-old brain. And Dave Foley, obviously from Kids in the Hall. I fluctuate between Dave Foley and Scott Thompson being my favorite. I think it depends what my mood is and time, and they have very different styles. Dave Foley was always a straight man and also famously the prettiest woman when they did dress up. but he was the one that immediately out of Kids in the Hall started to get fame. I mean, Mark McKinney went back to Saturday Night Live and was on there, and they each had their own projects. But Dave Foley immediately landed in news radio and the leading voice in A Bug's Life when Pixar was first getting off the ground. Because Bug's Life was their second feature?
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing that, though, was this around when Dave Foley's personal life was in turmoil? Because I know
that we're going to have to get into.
Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the way that it plays out, because it is very interesting, because this movie really does stand as the tipping point as to what happened with Dave Foley. And so while he started working on this screenplay when they were actually working on the screenplay for Brain Candy. He was kind of juggling both balls at the same time. And very famously, I love Brain Candy as well. It's a wonderfully flawed film. I will tackle it on this show at some point. He was having this sort of thing that he was falling out. A lot of the other kids very openly, like if you read any books on them, they're open that they were really jealous of the success that he was having south of the border, that he was now Hollywood Dave Foley, as it were. And the writing process on Brain Candy was an extremely difficult one. Particularly the way that the Kids in the Hall work is that they had their writing partners and they would go off separately. And I believe Dave Foley would mainly write with Kevin MacDonald. I could be wrong with that, but I think that's the way. And then Scott Thompson would kind of flip between the two groups because you had Bruce McCullough and Mark McKinney with their shared background because they were from the two separate improv groups that came together to make the kids. So in Brain Candy, all of a sudden they were under pressure to make this movie, and they were all writing together at the same time, firing off ideas, and it made into a very troubled production. They were fighting with each other, not very happy. And then Dave Foley off on the side with two gentlemen, David Anthony Higgins and Jay Kogan. We'll get to them because they're actually pretty interesting in just a second. But just to explain the gestation of this film, he was going off and having a blast writing this movie with them. So he was like, it made the process for him, and he's hardly in Brain Candy, rather famously, if you know Kids in the Hall lore. But he was off having a good time writing this film. So eventually, they start getting this off the ground. Dave Foley was originally going to direct, but he couldn't because of news radio and the time and stuff like that. But this was supposed to be the testing ground of him as a screenwriter and him as a leading man in Hollywood, because he was having a lot of traction. We'll get into the fate of the wrong guy just to kind of go into the basics here. So this was supposed to be the sort of big testing ground. And then rather famously, it died on the vine, not because it's bad. And one thing we're going to talk about is defining, is this a flop or not? Because can something be a flop if it's never released?
Also, I think it's so of its time too, because being 97, that was when we were starting to see a more direct-to-video aspect, and that was in the era, as you're saying, is it a flop or not? And I don't know, I kind of like that era, because there was stuff that financially, as I say that in quotes, may not have made a ton of money, but from the audience point of view, they loved it. And this, I think, this falls into that category, right? Dave
Foley has gone on the record saying that this is the one thing he is the most proud of in his career.
Excellent. I would love to know where you found all this information.
Diligence. One thing I'll be totally honest is my DVD copy of The Wrong Guy, because I actually own it, does have a film commentary with one of the screenwriters and the director. It's not the most insightful commentary, because a lot of it, and this is something we'll get back to about the idea of whether or not this is a good film. I would say for years that this was a guilty pleasure, and now I've totally shoved that aside. Well, just to quickly loop around and just kind of get the history of this out of the way. So what happened is that it was going to be released in Canada and released by Hollywood Pictures, a distribution company in the States. Before that could happen, it was bought out by our dear friend Disney. And Disney, apparently Michael Eisner was still in control of Disney at the time. And I don't have a direct quote from Eisner, but I did come across a couple of sources where they were like, Eisner just hated the movie and buried it.
Yeah, that's what he did best, right?
So exactly. So partially we have Disney to thank for this movie's lack of success. So that's more or less the rundown of the background. A little bit later, we will go into his co-collaborators, but I think it's probably beneficial just to dig into the movie itself. So I have my notes in front of me here, and most of it are just lines from the movie. It's just so quotable, and every time I watch it, I'm amazed at how funny this movie is. I know that sounds redundant talking about a comedy, but you just forget how snappy and constant the jokes are in this film. So on this note, what's your background with the movie? Where did you discover it?
I was trying to do the mental math on it, and I saw this movie just by fluke of luck. I was back living in BC. It was when I was working on a TV show called Dead Man's Gun, and I was living in a house.
I remember that one. Yeah, that's cool that you worked on that.
Yeah. I did about, I think, 8 months on that show, and it was just a rental. I was living in a house with I think it was 3 or 4 other dudes. We were all just mountain biker party dudes, and someone came back from the video store with it one day. Dave Foley being on the cover, and we all just sat down and had a couple beers, and it enraptured our whole household. Mm-hmm. And as you said, the quotability of it, it's as I was telling you earlier, I was listening to your Bob and Doug episode, and it's, in my mind, almost that level of quotability, where it's just every other line is something silly, and it's not spoiler for the ending, but I would say for years afterwards, and a line in-joke with us was, I fell on my keys every time someone would say, at the skateboard park. But people would never understand why 5 guys would lose their minds every time someone pulled that out.
Not to get ahead of ourselves, but one of my favorite sequences, because the movie basically is like little set pieces and gags strung together by this plot, quote unquote, going on. Because the plot actually isn't going on. One of the catches of the film is the fact that Dave Foley's character, Nelson Hibbert, I believe is his name, stumbles across his boss's dead body in one of the funniest sequences of the film, attempts to put the knife back into his head while he's freaking out. Seriously, I think that is one of the funniest sequences ever committed to film. Just that moment of him trying to put the knife back into the body and then freaking out.
Have you watched it recently?
Oh yeah, for preparation for the show, I watched a commentary for the first time yesterday.
So I watched, Kathy and I watched it last night. When they cut back after that whole scene, and they cut back to the office where the real murderer jumps up. If you look at the office, he's touched so much of it. Just freeze frame it. I mean, there is stuff all over the walls. There's blood on the plants. That in itself is a whole other scene I'd like to see.
Yeah, and there was quite a fair bit cut from this movie, and we'll probably never see a director's cut. Very famously, Mark McKinney also had a cameo along with Kevin McDonald, which was cut. So he was in there as well. But anyway, so go back to what I was saying. The plot is actually non-existent because they immediately see the person who actually murdered the boss leave afterwards. So he thinks he's on the lam. So it's literally all these little bits while he's on the run from the law, which isn't actually after him. And to go back to the quotability, one of my favorite parts is, I don't have the actor's name in front of me. He was on Just Shoot Me, but he plays a conspiracy nut in the car.
Oh, yes, I have his thing. Born and raised in Toronto, too. Enrico Colantoni.
Yeah. And like I said, I mainly know him from Just Shoot Me, but when he's talking about the Kennedy assassination, and he's like, how many people killed JFK? And he's like, I don't know, 1? And he's like, no, none. His head just did that. And the whole line about killing, all you need to kill somebody is 2 tea bags and a piece of wax paper.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's hundreds, and we could just sit here and go this line, him naming himself Enema Bag Jones, in the hospital.
You have a favorite daughter.
Yes, exactly. I don't know. And I swore to God that this wasn't going to be us just reciting bits over and over again from the film, but it just goes to show, just how much there is and how deeply packed it is. Oh God, I mean, I swore to God I wouldn't do this. The scene where he's trying to glue the fence together and it all falls down. And then he's like, well, time to get back. 3rd time's the charm. And he's just being chipper about it, trying to glue a fence together. Anyways, for me, I clearly remember seeing this poster in a coming soon slot at the Manulife cinemas.
Really?
Back in the day. And I was like, oh, Dave Foley's in a movie? I was a big Kids in the Hall fan. I saw Brain Candy in the theater, and I didn't even know this thing was out there. And then it just came and went. So eventually, when it came out on DVD, I just bought it blind. I just watched it, and I've loved it ever since. And it's one of those, I kind of equate it to Clue in a weird way, that for a long time, a lot of people thought it was pretty shitty, but I love Clue. And everybody that I've shown that movie to is this movie is great. Like, how did I not know? And The Wrong Guy is kind of like that. Everyone that I've shown it to, I mean, it's not, let's get this out of the way. It's not the most brilliant movie ever made. It's a good movie. And people are always surprised that they had no idea about it. Even people that are Kids of the Hall fans.
Like as I mentioned earlier, though, it's such just a perfect movie of its time, right? Like it ages well.
It really ages well. Like
almost 25 years later, it still holds up.
It ages better than a lot of contemporary comedies, because this movie does get a little funny when it comes to some of the sex stuff, but it ages better than the American Pie movies.
Those are just horrific, man.
No, but those were like really big, successful movies at the time. This came out like the same year as Liar, Liar. That I find that movie almost completely unwatchable, but I'm just not a Jim Carrey guy. But this movie still holds up fine.
I think what it comes down to though is the simplicity, and it has a feel that there wasn't a lot of fingers in the pot, where they had producers that saw the idea and just let these guys go about doing what they do best. Where I think, as you were saying with Brain Candy, I think there was a little bit too many money men going yes no, throwing the tumultuous writing aspect, and I don't know. I think, like as we're saying, The Wrong Guy is just one of those little diamonds in the rough. Where, like, if you didn't know about it, it's such a treat. I'd love to be able to see this for the first time again.
Yeah. And I mean, when I'm doing research and, diving into the deepest corners of the internet, it's always coming up on underrated comedies, those sort of listicles, that kind of populate everywhere. I just wanted to go into the other people involved in the background just really quickly, because you're absolutely right. It was these three guys wrote this screenplay in their spare time before they got it produced. There really wasn't a lot of interference. One of the guys, David Anthony Higgins, who also plays Detective Arlen in the film. Yeah. He's one of the co-screenwriters, who is one of the cops chasing after the murderer. I'm doing the air quotes thing. One of my favorite lines that I came up with in research, somebody described his character as being lethargic but corrupt, which perfectly encapsulates this cop character. But he's one of the co-screenwriters, and he has a long history in TV writing, particularly he acted and wrote for Ellen and Malcolm in the Middle back in the day.
Well, his profile is huge. This man is constantly working. When I looked him up the other day, I did that. Holy moly! Like it's quite a track record for him.
Well, on that note, the other guy, Jay Kogan, he was a sitcom writer who wrote for Frasier, but most famously wrote for Simpsons. And he doesn't have a huge list, but if you go onto his Wikipedia page and look at the Simpsons episodes he wrote, they are almost all classics. And then behind the director chair, it was interesting. Originally, Dave Foley was supposed to direct it, but couldn't. They got this guy, David Steinberg. Are you familiar with him?
No, but I'm just going to...
Yeah, take a look at his Wikipedia page. Apparently, this guy was a huge stand-up comedian in the 60s and early 70s. He was on The Tonight Show all the time. He guest hosted it 12 times. And this guy had huge albums. I had never heard from him. I'm not a comedy nerd. I know what I know, but apparently this guy was quite popular. And I mean, to guest host The Tonight Show was a huge deal at the time. It was basically one of the biggest shots in the arm you could have for your career, to appear on The Tonight Show, let alone host it. But then he went to direct TV. He did a couple of features, neither of which I know. I didn't make note of them, but he went on to direct episodes of Golden Girls, Friends, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Seinfeld, and Mad About You. So this guy has a huge history in television, and it kind of shows in the movie. It isn't a spectacularly filmed movie, but it's very by the book. You could tell it's a TV director. Yeah.
It's a perfect film school movie. It's if this is what you want to do, how to do it, stay on your pages and your budget, right? You're not going to win any Academy Awards for it, but at the same time too, it's not one of those. It's breaking all of the rules and it looks ridiculous.
Yeah. And then we'll just round out the cast really quickly, but definitely some of these people we'll be coming back to. Obviously David Foley and then David Anthony Higgins, but then honestly one of my favorite actors on the planet, Colm Feore, is the actual murderer. We'll get into his character because he is great. Again, probably my absolute favorite line of the entire film is, "Oh my God, we can't catch him. Did you see how he pulled himself into that grate?"
Yeah.
That is one that comes back to me all the time. Then Nelson, the main character, ends up in the small town, and he befriends a young woman who I love. I saw a lot of reviewers taking Jennifer Tilly's character to cast, but I really like her performance in this. Joe Flaherty, the legendary SCTV guy playing the father, the poor banker that's going to be put out of business by all the dirty farmers. And then the rest of the movie is just basically just, you'll recognize him TV, like Canadian TV personalities. Yeah. People like Dan Redican, Richard Chevalier, Alan Scarf, who plays Farmer Brown in it.
Boyd Banks.
Then Kenneth Welsh, who plays Mr. Nagel, the murdered boss, who was also in Twin Peaks. He was the Wyndham Earl. He plays Wyndham Earl in Twin Peaks, which I didn't put two and two together. But I mean, all of these guys, these names might mean nothing when I read them, but when you see them, you're like, oh, I've seen them on random CBC shows or whatever. And all really good, solid actors. So for the movie, I love the score for this movie. It's like this sort of play on like old Hitchcock films. And just to note, the opening credits are amazing. These old like Saul Bass throwback design. I have a design background and I love anything Saul Bass. I'll go into deep dives on YouTube and just type in Saul Bass and watch his like movie intros and stuff that he's done. But yeah, that's basically my research out of the way. This is what I managed to dig up about the film.
I'm surprised you found all of that, because I've spent, like, ever since we started talking about this, I've done a few deep dives, but it's always been kind of the repeating info. Like, I did find out, I can't remember where it was, but where the miniature golf course was, and it was in farmland just outside of Toronto. But even that was one of those, like, how did I figure that out?
Let's go into Colm Feore. Wonderful, legendary Canadian actor Colm Feore. I will gladly watch anything in it. I call it the Max von Sydow factor after watching Strange Brew and a lot of Max von Sydow's films. He just elevates everything that he's in. He just kind of classes up the joint.
He makes everything a bit more classy. He always has that look, though, of like the nicest mean guy you'll ever meet. You know? Yeah, that staunch, like, I can hug you or kill you at the same time. It's up to me. And then, well, his background, too, is just absolutely ridiculous. He's been in everything, and having him in there just makes everything that much better, too.
Yeah, and apparently he really threw himself into this role. Like, if you listen to the film commentary, they're talking about, like, yeah, he really got into those guns. You know, he's, like, playing with them and pretending to load them and just really kind of, you know, feeling them out. But he basically plays...
We watched that, though.
Yeah, but he
did not like it. He blinked. Every single shot in that scene, he blinks.
Really?
Yeah, if you watched the very famous, he jumped off the balcony and did a flip. Every single trigger pull, in slow motion, he closes his eyes before he pulls the trigger.
That's funny.
He's not used to guns.
That is definitely one of those will not unsee things when I watch in the future. But he basically plays a super hitman.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like, after he does the murder and he's exiting the building, just to get out of the building, it's multiple costume changes, ridiculously timed props falling out of the walls and vents. Like, it's just, you know, firing off what's it called? A grappling hook, you know, and sliding.
Every kid's dream, right?
Yeah, like, just a ridiculously complex. Like, this guy is almost, like, too competent at his job. And basically the running gag is that he gets undone because he thinks that Nelson is onto him and is like this super like agent chasing after him on the run. And I wish we had more scenes with Dave Foley and Colm Feore together, you know, because I think they would have a really interesting energy. Because I mean, the other thing,
or do you think it would be like the law of diminishing returns, where it would maybe a couple more, but I think if you put too much of them together, it would almost be an overkill.
Maybe. I just like this idea of the novelty of Dave Foley and Colm Feore being on screen together, maybe. But yeah, and you know, Colm Feore just is gradually driven insane by this whole sort of concept of being convinced that this guy is following him and everybody telling him, no, actually he's an absolute idiot. And him basically can't believe that he's wrong. Yeah, so anything you want to go into here?
The hard thing, as you said earlier, is to just stay away from the whole quoting it all the way through. I actually have it going on my computer in the background. As I said before, it's just one of those wonderful little films that came out of the woodwork, no pomp and circumstances, and it's a great connector as you said, you posted it online one day, and it's one of those movies like, you ever seen The Wrong Guy? And if someone's like, no, you can step aside. If someone's like, yeah, and they have that smile on their face, you have that instant friendship and connection just through this film.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we kind of got the gist of what the first chunk of the movie is. The back half, the movie kind of switches gears when he decides to stop, when he runs into, I always confuse if it's Meg or Jennifer Tilly. I just get the names confused all the time.
Jennifer.
It's Jennifer Tilly in this one.
Yeah.
Just runs into her. She's hitchhiking. Or, sorry,
He's hitchhiking.
Nelson is hitchhiking. She picks him up. We quickly find out, as a bit of physical comedy, that she's a narcoleptic. But she's this weird sort of character. Like I said, when I was doing research, there were a lot of people writing reviews on the time really digging on her. I really like her performance. I think she has this weird balance of naivety and sexuality, which is really odd, and I think it really plays off of Nelson's character really well. I think they actually have a really good chemistry in the movie.
That is true, yeah.
Yeah, and you kind of actually buy them, because the whole thing, one of my favorite descriptions of the Nelson character was that he is vanilla to the point of sociopathy. And, I can kind of see people kind of bag on the back half of the movie, but I do like it. Just, it kind of gradually humanizes Nelson a little bit. You do get this sort of idea when, there are people around him and he's not just marrying to move his career forward or anything like that. And he never becomes competent. And I don't think he really becomes a non-sociopath. But it's interesting to see that chipped away with his character. And it also gives Dave Foley something else to play off of. Because, I mean, we'll go into this. Dave Foley throws himself into this role 100%. He did a lot of his own stunts. He famously, when he flipped into the bin, when he first goes onto the lamb, he wrenched his ankle. So if you look really closely, like when he's in the bus station trying to get the bus ticket, you can notice that he's limping. It's another one of those once you see, you can't unsee things. In the commentary, it's funny when he's talking about that missed leap onto the train and him talking about like how he was actually like doing that stunt and how he almost got like pulled under the train. But like this was a passion project for him. Like he understood that this was, the potential to be a big calling card and he wanted to throw himself in. So he totally commits to every single bit. And I think he does end up with this ridiculous character bringing a good amount of humanity when he reaches this small town.
Yeah, I'm at a loss right now. I did realize we just skipped over something in the beginning of the film that a lot of people may or may not know. The quintuple cameo or quadruple cameo.
Oh, yes. Well, right after he flips into the bin.
I literally have a screen pause right now, and it gives away what city it's supposed to be filmed in.
Isn't it Cleveland?
Yes, Stephen Page is wearing a Cleveland police uniform.
Yeah, this is one of those cases where it's like, why didn't they just place it in Toronto?
Yeah, but that was
apparently he's supposed to start off in Cleveland, and the small town is in Texas. That is some random little bit of information I found out today digging around. It was some City of Toronto website that talks about location shooting and lists movies and stuff like that. And apparently, the small town is apparently in Texas, but we haven't actually said it. Yeah, the Bare Naked Ladies, very early in their career when they were first starting to get international recognition, play this group of cops that force Nelson to stay hiding because they just stop outside of the bin and they're doing basically a barbershop quartet, but it's a quintet. So a barbershop quintet doing this really cute little song, Gangster Girl. Yeah. Which they wrote specifically for the movie. Dave Foley in the commentary jokingly says that, go ahead and rip an MP3 of it and get the song out there because it doesn't exist in any official capacity. So go ahead and do that if you're a Bare Naked Ladies fan. But no, that's a really great cameo. And it's one of those, like, even when I first saw it, before they start singing, I was like, is that Stephen Page? When he first, like, walks by, like, I grew up with the Bare Naked Ladies. Like, again, like Kids in the Hall, I was the perfect age when the original yellow cassette came out, living in Toronto, like, them playing Much Music and stuff like that. So I don't listen to the Bare Naked Ladies now, but they were huge at the time. So I just spotted them right away in the movie. And yeah, apparently they just volunteered to do it. They were shooting a video or something nearby, and or they were playing a show, and they just wrote the song in a matter of a day and then came in and did it. It was like not planned. It was just this little bit that they threw in there and recorded.
Well, and it works out as a great little scene. And, as you said, it adds that secret Canadiana to it. As you said before, you're surprised that they didn't actually try and write Toronto into the script. But that comes out of the 90s where Canadian based movies didn't sell on the market at
Yeah.
all.
And
Right?
it's a Hollywood North era of Canadian
Absolutely, yeah.
filmmaking. Like literally, we're going to pretend it's Hollywood, but we're just north because it's cheaper to film up here. So once he gets to the small town, we have Joe Flaherty. I think this is the last person we need to talk about because, Joe Flaherty being he's not Canadian originally, but a Canadian comedy legend back with SCTV.
Absolutely.
He's another guy that he's been in a lot of shitty movies, but he manages to make every movie that he's in just a little bit better.
Yeah, well, he's one of those actors, I think, very much that as long as you're professional and you approach him, you'll always get a yes. Like he probably has that base rate, and then you get a name. He's the Canadian Danny Trejo in a way, right?
I've never thought about it that way, but okay. But he's great in this movie as just this basically worn down, exacerbated, has this narcoleptic daughter. His son is off in the military somewhere. No, Lord knows where his wife is. They're so poor that they can't afford ice in one scene.
Giant farmhouse.
Yeah, exactly. And they're eating, living off of tinned ham. And he has problems at work. I mean, in one of the most cleverest bits in the whole movie that I'm amazed I've never seen it before, the bank is going to be closed down by this wealthy local farmer. It's just a great setup. All of this could have been a movie unto itself, really.
Absolutely.
But Joe Flaherty, his character Fred, just reluctantly, because just Jennifer Tilly's character Lynn, you get the sort of view that she's constantly picking up strays, bringing them home, but agrees to let Nelson work at the bank because he has an Ivy League degree, or rather he went to a college near an Ivy League. Like it was the same bus basically that you would take, which is a cute little gag. Yeah. And it's basically just a comedy of errors at this point. The farmer finds out that Nelson is a hypothetical murderer, or what is the phrase that they use? Alleged murderer. Of course, the hitman ends up there at the all-time. Hilarity ensues, and it ends up at a showdown at a golf course.
Oh, the good old mini golf course.
Yeah.
And this is one of those mini golf courses that are of legend, because I don't know about you, but as a child, I've always wanted to play at one of these, yet have never seen anything that's this ornate and large.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I loved mini golf as a kid. I absolutely loved it. If we were traveling down south somewhere and there was a mini golf course, I was always pestering my parents to stop off.
Yeah, no, they're always great in movies, and then in real life, when you get to go to one, it's always a bit of this is it.
Yeah, and then famously in our conversation, Colm Fiore's character, who is literally only called the Killer, falls on his keys and is undone by that. Essentially, there are a couple of big reveals, but again, the plot isn't important. Really, the plot only exists to string together all these great little bits that, again, we only scratch the surface of here. And
it's very much one of those. It could just be me being a bad conversationalist, but at the same time, too, it's a hard movie to talk about because you need to visually see it and appreciate it and take it in for yourself. You can't explain a Kids in the Hall skit and get the same reaction.
Oh, like explaining the pen sketch to somebody. And you're sitting there being exactly. My pen, and somebody's looking at you like, what? Okay, well, I agreed. And like I said, I didn't want this to just evolve into us talking about our favorite bits. We've talked about the movie pretty much. So what I wanted to go to, now, famously, like I said, this movie just wasn't released in the States, and in Canada, it came and went. It was on my radar that this movie was coming out, and it came and went so quickly, I didn't even realize it.
Yeah.
And again, it just happened to be companies being bought out at the wrong time, just mucking with the distribution. He's open about it. Rather sadly, Dave Foley's career just nosedove after this. He's been rather open on podcasts like WTF with Mark Maron and stuff like that, where he just lays everything bare. And for research, I actually tracked down that episode because I never listened to it before. I decided to listen to it. I'm not a huge Mark Maron guy, but I do find him interesting if he has the right guest. And that's a really interesting but heartbreaking thing because, I grew up loving Dave Foley. Like I said, he's one of my favorite kids. And we won't be salacious and go too far into this, but he had apparently a very destructive marriage breakup, which broke up at the peak of his fame when he was on getting a salary from being on a very successful sitcom. And then when all that dried up, essentially even though his income went down, he still owed the ex-wife for child support the level of money that he was making at his peak. So that kind of forced him to do things like, take roles in like Uwe Boll films. But the guy stuck with it, pulled himself together, and, you listen to interviews with him, but it is fascinating that is a weird sort of post-it on this movie, that you almost can't talk about it without talking about the potential of Dave Foley and living in a what if universe that not just if this movie was successful, but if this movie just allowed him to continue on the way that he was, try to pursue the trajectory that his career was going.
I think with the person that he is, or he was back then, that would have probably been quite a destructive pathway.
Yeah.
A path for him. Like, nobody deserves to have what happened to him happen, but I think it was the great leveler for him. He is due for a major comeback. The Kids in the Hall have done some touring again, have they not?
Yeah, and they've done that for a couple of reasons. They've been very open as well. Some of it has been to help Dave Foley out with this financial situation that he finds himself in, and also to rally behind Scott Thompson when he was recovering from his cancer that he had a few years ago. So it's kind of nice. It's a sweet thing with Kids of the Hall. And like I said, eventually with the show, we will do TV shows. I do want to talk about Kids of the Hall more specifically in the future and separately talk about Brain Candy because that's its own story. But it is kind of touching to see as they get older, they still kind of look out for each other and rally around each other. And even though that they have had their differences, you do have Kevin McDonald popping up in The Wrong Guy. They've always popped up in each other's projects here and there. It's kind of a sort of Monty Python quality that they still always never quite stopped working with each other, even though they've gone off different ways. So, yeah.
It was that old familial thing of that, I love you, it doesn't mean I like you.
Yeah,
right? So.
Exactly. Yeah. And I do have a couple of books that have been written about Kids in the Hall, and I did go into them for a little bit of the research. I mean, even if it's just 3 pages where they mention what was going on with The Wrong Guy, it's still 3 pages that exist in the universe that have anything to say about this movie. It goes back to my original point, though, which is how do you measure if a movie is a failure? And especially now, because this movie was considered a failure because it didn't make any money. Well, it didn't make any money because it wasn't released without anything behind it. So by that metric, I know we're supposed to gauge if a movie is successful by whether or not it makes its money, but it's not even released into the world. So it gets a stigma that it's bad because it didn't make money, which I've already covered is not true. And then it had this stigma that it was a bad movie because it was direct-to-video. Well, guess who did a direct-to-video movie last year? Fucking Martin Scorsese. You know, the model of how movies are released now is different. You have comedies much worse than this one just being dropped onto Netflix all the time. So I think the way that we view film now in this age of streaming is perfect time for this movie to have a reappraisal, because it doesn't have a lot of that dogma of like being like, oh, well, it's a direct-to-video movie, so it can't be any good, and we have seen the rise of these sort of middle of the road comedies because they're so cheap to make on all these streaming platforms. I mean, this is better than any comedy Adam Sandler has put out over the last 10 years.
Absolutely.
So I think it is time for people to reach out and discover this. I mean, like I said, is it the best movie ever? No, but it's delightful. It's genuinely funny. It has a lot of heart, and like I said, I've seen this movie probably at least a dozen times. I watched it twice in the last week because I watched it with the commentary. And then last night, for notes, I always do like a final watch with my notes after I do research to see if anything else comes into context. And I'm still chuckling through the whole thing. And the movie is like over 15 years old. I've seen it like a dozen times. And I'm not a dude who rewatches stuff a lot. And I'm still looking forward to like every single lines that I forgot about, So I think this is a movie that does really need to be checked out again.
Yeah, as you said, like I wish the licensing ridiculousness for streaming platforms wasn't so grotesque, because you could drop this on Netflix or Amazon Prime or something like that and open it to a whole new audience. Because as you said, when it came out in '97 with no fanfare, you saw a poster for it at the Manual Life Center, which is one of those movies play there for a couple days.
Yeah.
And that was the era too where, like, unless you were a film nerd or a cinema nerd, you didn't know about stuff at all. There was no outreach. There was no website. You're talking about the nascent days of the internet and all of that. Um, the your local mom and pop shop video stores was your best bet, and if you're like me, you were there every other day getting a bunch of stuff. I do wish you could almost throw this on a festival circuit again,
Yeah.
just to show people that like here's a gem, a Canadian gem that has aged well. Like 97, dude, that's almost 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, that's a big chunk of time.
And I knew about it, and I bring this up on the show quite a fair bit, especially out here in Halifax, where a lot of people come from very rural backgrounds. I've talked to a few guests that, just didn't have the exposure that I was lucky to have. This was on my radar because I lived in a city where this movie did play. One of the few places it actually played in a movie theater, in Toronto. I was able to, go to Suspect Video and track down a copy. Because I live on my way home from work, I walked by one of the best video stores in the country, if not the world. So it was on my radar because of that. I was spoiled with the exposure that I had. And even then it just barely slipped through.
Well, like I said, I think the one of the only reasons why people do know about it is purely for seeing Dave Foley on the front cover of something.
Or word of mouth.
Yeah, because, like this is post Kids in the Hall. Now, is this pre-braid candy or post-braid candy?
I actually don't have the years in front of me. Like I said, they were being written around the same time. I'm pretty sure it was after it was released, but I know for sure they were being written around the same time.
Yeah. Like it's just that's probably one of the only reasons why people have seen it. Other than that, like the cover is nothing special.
Yeah.
It's not one of those pop out and catchy. It's just one of those. It's hard to say without demeaning it, but it's like there's nothing special about it at all. Yet it's such a special film at the same time.
I'm going to leave it at that. I think that's a good way to wrap this here. Joshua, what do you think this movie says about Canada?
Okay, so I've been thinking about this. I think what this says about Canada is we are really good at camouflaging our product. Because in no way, shape, or form would you think this is a Canadian film unless you actually did your research, and as you have pointed out, there's very few and far between anything to research, but it doesn't have that stereotypical Canadian look to it. It's just one of those, we can slip it into the zeitgeist, and unless you're in the know, you would never know this was a Canadian film. So I like how it's sneakily Canadian, I guess would be the best way to say it for me.
Perfect. Okay, well, thanks for coming on, Josh. This was really fun. It's good to finally actually do this because it was probably over a year ago at this point that the idea first came out. You say hi to Kathy for me.
I will. I think she's having a nap with our little guy right now.
She probably earned it. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Josh.
Hopefully it works out.
Definitely. You take care.
You too. Ciao.
Bye. All right. North of Normal is a product of Eldritch Creative, which can be found on Facebook at Eldritch Creative and Instagram at eldritch.creative. This show can be found at North of Normal on Facebook and on Instagram at North of Normal Pod. Intro music is by Dad vs. Son out of Hamilton, Ontario. That's it for now. Be safe.